This episode contains brief mentions of suicide. Caution is advised. If you or someone you love is struggling with suicidal thoughts or self-harm, please seek help. The 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline can be reached by dialing 988. You can also text 988 or head to the website at 988lifeline.org. Welcome to the very first episode of Spirited Sagas, the podcast for all your ghostly and urban legend curiosities. I'm your creator and host, Andrea Robards. Most of us have watched or have at least heard of the 2013 supernatural horror film, The Conjuring. The movie follows renowned paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren as they try to help the Perron family get rid of the dark forces that are attached to them. While the movie is based on a true story, it mainly follows the case files of the Warrens and, of course, adds Hollywood liberties. In this episode, I'm going to dive into the actual Perron family account of just some of their hauntings at the farmhouse for the decade they lived there, which was written by Andrea Perron, the oldest daughter. There is a lot that I won't be able to cover in this episode, unfortunately. So, if you want to read the books yourself, there are 3 volumes, all called House of Darkness, House of Light, which you can purchase anywhere books are sold or check out at your local library. The Old Arnold Estate, also known as the Conjuring House, is in Harrisville, Rhode Island, and is open to the public when booked in advance for ghost hunting events and overnight stays. The 2-story farmhouse with a cellar was built circa 1736, 40 years before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. There are also claims of the house being a part of the Underground Railroad, and I feel it is also important to note that the Nipmuc tribe occupied the valley before the area was colonized and the farmhouse was built. Dark forces, ghosts that just like to visit, the spirits of previous owners, and several children have been seen in the house and on the grounds that consist of a river, pine grove, and more, with its original 200 acres when the Perron family bought it. The Perron family consists of Carolyn, a stay-at-home mother, and Roger Perron, an on-the-road salesman who is barely home a lot of the time, along with their 5 daughters, Andrea, Nancy, Christine, Cindy, and April. They bought the house during the winter of 1970 and lived there until 1980. When they bought the house, the previous owner, Mr. Kenyon, took Roger on a walk and told him, "For the sake of your family, leave the lights on at night," but didn't allude to what he was implying to, and Roger didn't think anything of it. The girls reported seeing their first ghost the day they moved in. A figure of a man, named Manny by Nancy, would watch them in the hallway where he stood. He came off as kind and gentle to them. He would show up often, never really interacting with them, but watched them with a bemused or concerned look on his face. Other instances that happened quite frequently during the 10-year stay they were there, almost as soon as they moved in, were reports of seeing their own breath while the person next to them was fine. Bouts of the house being freezing cold, colder than it was outside. Footsteps would be heard above them. The air would become thick, heavy, and dark, and they would begin to feel queasy. An heirloom, which was an antique clock from Roger's late father, would randomly stop for no reason. An entity would shake them and move their beds while they slept. Chairs were pulled out from under the kids. Toys moved on their own. Voices were heard whispering. Hair was even pulled. A woman that smelled like flowers and fruit would come and tuck them in and kiss their foreheads shortly after Carolyn did. Horses would freak out. Their cat was always hiding somewhere. Family dogs wouldn't pass through the front hallway where the cellar door was. They would choose to leave through the front door and walk around the house and then scratch at the kitchen door to be let back in to eat their food. Needless to say, the farmhouse was alive with death. It wasn't just the house. The grounds are haunted too. Indigenous children spirits are spotted playing in the river and around it. The Bakers, a father and a son duo along with their dog, all who drowned in the river, are spotted at the river playing and are also seen in the house, multiple times by the kids. They never acknowledged the humans that inhabited their former home. A few weeks after moving in, while Roger was gone and the kids were all in school except for April, who was napping inside the house, Carolyn went to look at the barn to see if it was outfitted to hold farm animals. She noticed that it felt colder inside the barn than it did outside. After confirming that the burn was good to go, she turned to leave to head back inside. She heard a noise and, thinking it was a bird, she turned around and saw a hand scythe rotating in the air by itself before flying directly towards her. She couldn't move, frozen in place as it rushed towards her. It struck her, hitting her neck and shoulder, then fell to the ground by her feet. She was expecting a grave wound, but when she slowly reached up, she found that all the layers of clothing and her leather jacket she was wearing to brave the cold outside had saved her. With her jacket destroyed and a deep bruise on her shoulder, Carolyn promptly ran back inside the house and thus began the torment of a darker energy. Another winter day, tired of the house always being so cold, even with the heat turned up, Carolyn took it upon herself to open a fireplace that had been sealed by the previous owner, for reasons unknown. In doing so, she opened up a plethora of supernatural activity, more than what was already happening. When the girls came home from school and a neighbor came to visit, Carolyn went to take a shower and clean up. They all came running when they heard her screaming to find a hanger hitting her repeatedly before dropping to the ground. That neighbor never came over again. A little girl would show up in Christine and Cindy's room, sometimes in a nice dress, happy as she walked across the room. Sometimes she would look very skinny and sick, and would cry and call for her mom. It was during those times, hearing the little girl crying out, that would make anyone that could hear her weep too. The cellar and pantry doors soon began opening and closing on their own. A smell of death would come mysteriously and disperse a time later, with no explanation. Big black flies would swarm the house, and they could never find their nest. No amount of extermination would keep them away until one day, Carolyn broke down and told Roger about what was happening when he was on the road. Once she acknowledged that the house was haunted, the flies seemed to have disappeared and never came back during their time living there. They didn't think anything of it until they met Lorraine Warren years later, and she told them it was a sign of what to come. Roger did not believe Carolyn about the hauntings, for he did not believe in ghosts, which caused a lot of arguments between the two, which always seemed to ramp up the malicious energy. Andrea quoted her mother saying to her father, "Roger, you don't get it. Your belief or disbelief has absolutely no bearing on their existence whatsoever. They don't give a damn about what you believe." One big event that happened was after Roger took Carolyn out on a date. They came home to the house smelling like death and very cold. The cellar door was wide open when Roger knew that he checked it twice to make sure it was closed. That night, when they lay in bed sleeping, Carolyn was awoken by something. When she looked over, she claimed she saw, and I quote, "No face, only a rancid mass of rotting flesh covered in what looked like blackened cobwebs, its neck broken, hanging to the side, with no hands or feet." It slowly began to approach her, and as it did, Carolyn tried to scream, but nothing would come out. She began to kick Roger and pull on his hair to wake him up, but his body seemed lifeless. Carolyn was afraid that this entity had killed him and was now going to do the same to her. It began to lean over her, the foul stink of death nauseating her as she tried to get away. In those last moments when it came face to face, so to say, Carolyn whispered, "God, help me." She pulled the covers over her face and braced for impact. Moments later, nothing came. Her prayers were answered. She looked back over at Roger and he was breathing, no longer looking lifeless next to her. The next morning when he awoke, his back was covered in bloody scratches. Someone didn't like the attention Roger gave Carolyn that night. Soon after, Carolyn began having fainting spells, was constantly losing weight and looking older. Doctors couldn't find anything wrong with the otherwise healthy woman. A couple of times she fainted near the fire, where she would have been seriously burned if not for Roger being quick in moving her. Another time was when everyone was gone. She was out in the garden, placing tomato stakes into the ground. She fainted, and when she woke up, she was impaled above the hip by a stake that had already been planted in the dirt. It somehow was neatly pulled out of the dirt and plunged into her. Sometimes, someone besides Carolyn would be approached by this malicious entity. Cindy woke up in the middle of the night once, hearing hissing noises, thinking it was their cat. Upon looking over at Christine's bed, she noticed that Chris didn't look like herself. She was moaning, her eyes black, and her skin seemed to move like snakes were under it. She closed her eyes, went under the blankets, and prayed before she accidentally fell asleep. When she woke up, Chris was okay and didn't remember anything, but all 5 of the girls' blankets had been burnt around the edges. Cynthia's bed would rise and shake with her on it, and items would fly everywhere. No one heard her screams or the banging of the bed when this would happen multiple times during their entire stay. One night, for the very first time, a loud horn sounded 3 times as the family were watching a movie together. It shook the whole house and came from the cellar. Roger yelled and went down to check it out while the girls got closer to their mom. A large, heavy door had come off of its hinges and flew across the cellar. This occurrence with the horns happened 3 times in total in the 10 years that they lived there, and only when Roger was home. Carolyn told him that it was the former mistress of the house calling for him. He would scoff. The second and third time it happened, nothing was amiss, but he was touched along his back and shoulders. Twice. First, he would get really cold, then smell the stench of death, then he would feel the soft caress along his back. Another strong encounter that wore Carolyn down happened the night after Roger took her and the kids out for dinner and a treat. After they had fallen asleep, she was awakened to their bed moving and ending up in the middle of the room. Disoriented in the darkness, she could not understand what was happening until the room became freezing and a foul, familiar stench flooded the space. She could barely move her body, but her mind was fully awake. The room was suddenly ablaze with light, an ominous, fiery glow, illuminated by flames on top of torches carried by the dead. As unbearable as it was to watch, Carolyn could not look away, her gaze transfixed on the objects, which meant certain death to her family. She expected her heart to stop. This would be their end. So many of them, perhaps 8 or 10 spirits standing in the bedroom, each holding a wooden torch with something atop it resembling broom straw, each fully engulfed in a ball of fire. There was nowhere to hide. The house was humming with a reverberation Carolyn could feel in her sternum. It was deafening, loud enough to muffle a mother screaming if she had a voice to use. But the woman knew she'd been muted. She yanked on Roger's hair, shoving him repeatedly, jerking the covers from a cold, limp, lifeless body. Again, his back had become serrated, scratched beyond mortal recognition by the claws of a demon. A precise cadence emerged, established by the perpetual pounding of torches striking a wooden floor, their rhythmic chant uttered in tandem by spirits who didn't seem to notice her cowering in bed. There they stood, gathered together in front of both windows, encircling the bottom of the bed, a small child posted at each side of the footboard. Carolyn's rapt attention remained focused on the fires. She listened to their words, what they had come to warn, only as an afterthought as flames leapt toward the ceilings. Beseech thee leave, afore ye go, beware the flame, the fiery glow. Was mistress once, afore ye came, and mistress here will be again. Will drive ye out with fiery broom, will drive ye mad with death and gloom. An entity emerged from the crowd and began her approach. Carolyn recognized her as the one who'd come before. Her movements were tediously slow and deliberately threatening. Carolyn could never mistake this entity's evil intentions. It was reading her mind. In complete panic, during the fraction of a second she'd spent considering flight over fight, the bedroom door slammed shut, effectively trapping her inside. Flames leapt up from the straw on top of torches, yet there was no heat, no smoke in the room. It burned like wildfire, each strike of the floorboards resulting in the torches being raised once again in preparation for the next heavy blow. The drumbeat was relentless, deafening as it stood beside her, and still the demon advanced. An emaciated figure, no hands or feet, snapped at the neck, death by hanging, or so she presumed. This time, though, it had a face as hideous as anything she had ever seen. The eyes were black, hollow sockets peering into her soul. The nose appeared to be rotting off. What remained of that grotesque appendage was nothing but a few pieces of decaying flesh dangling loosely between a mesh of cobwebs. Its horrid sight and smell caused Carolyn to retch. Its mouth, drawing closer to her with each passing moment, uttered these threatening words with pleasure, as this wicked creature smiled, reveling in the terror expressed on the face of its victim. It revealed a set of chipped and jagged yellow teeth protruding from beneath thin, shriveled lips. Carolyn was certain she would lose her mind before she lost her life. None of the other spirits even acknowledged her presence. The spirit crept and conjured around her bed as light of dawn began to break, illuminating a gruesome scene in lurid detail. Leaning over then in toward its victim, the apparition issued the threat it had come to deliver, with purpose and reason, a message received, loud and clear. Was mistress once, afore ye came, and mistress here will be again. Will drive ye mad, with death and gloom, will drive ye into Satan's tomb. Thus has been spoken, thus has been read. Take leave of this place, or ye too will be dead. Suddenly, the bedroom became flooded with thick, acrid smoke, an ominous haze surrounding the emerging beast. Carolyn's aversion to this dark demon was so intense, violent tremors began to erupt throughout her trembling body, traveling uncontrollably through her frozen limbs, responding to the jolt as if being struck by a bolt of lightning. She lurched forward in bed, inexplicably drawn toward the apparition. As Carolyn was about to receive the kiss of death, the apparition slowly withdrew from her, then began to encircle the bed again, floating toward her husband. Arriving by the side, it hovered over him for a minute, then glanced upward, those black, vacant orbs staring through her. Grinning again, bearing its evil along with its fangs, the creature leered at the paralyzed woman while leaning in toward her husband. Carolyn closed her eyes. She prayed, speaking words in mind, Lord, be with me now. I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. The identical sound announcing their arrival, the combustion of flames in the bedroom, occurred once again. Carolyn waited, certainly knowing fire would consume them all. She could not move her mouth, but instead prayed from her soul. Bless me, Father. Take me if you must, but spare my children. Dear God, I beg of you, have mercy on us all. Her prayers had been more than enough to dispel of the evil at her husband's side, and the scene in front of her dispersed. And, while there was a darker force, the bent-necked lady, as they called her, the farmhouse was also home to benign spirits. A ghost would sweep the kitchen with their straw broom and leave a dirt pile for them to finish cleaning up. Ghosts would lift the phone receiver, change the radio and TV stations. Things would move from one place to another. The rocking chair would rock when Andrea would sing and play the guitar. The piano would play on its own. An antique radio would turn on and play on its own when it wasn't even plugged in, and figures would appear in the window. Sometimes, though, nothing would happen for weeks, or even a month, until an argument happened between the married couple and disrupted the ghostly silence. Shortly after, the Warrens were notified of what had been happening at the Perrons by a family friend. They came a couple of times in 1974, interviewing the family, learning about their haunts, and seeing Carolyn become weaker and weaker, a sign, they said, of oppression by a demonic entity. They decided to have a seance after the holidays, fearing for Carolyn and the kids. Along with the Warrens, 2 tech people, a priest, and a medium, they all set up and convinced a belligerent Roger that he had to participate to save his wife. When they began, immediately the table levitated. A vortex wind came out of nowhere, flicking their hair and making the candle flames blow back and forth, but never going out. Carolyn's body began to fold up into itself. Her eyes were not her eyes, and she began to speak in a voice that was not her own, and in a language not of this world. Her chair then levitated, and she was thrown across the room. Roger immediately went to check on her, and proceeded to kick everyone out of their house, scared for his wife. Unfortunately, the seance didn't get rid of any spirits. Benign spirits actually came more frequently after, and the dark force could still be smelled and felt every now and then. A time later, in a brief stint in the hospital due to pneumonia, Carolyn began to improve. The evil entity became less of a problem when Carolyn started taking back control of her life, deciding not to feed into with anger and straying away from fights with Roger. She started to gain weight, spent more time with their girls, and made an effort to be happy. Before the parents decided to move out, though, in 1981, a priest came to walk the house and told Carolyn that the house could not be cleansed. Thus, they decided to finally move across country when Carolyn stated that she would not last another winter in the house and had to get out. 20 years later, Nancy and Cindy decided to take a trip to their former home. Once they introduced themselves to the lady that lived there, she immediately invited them in to look at the restorations her and her husband had been doing to restore it to how it would have originally looked when it was first built. When the two walked in and stepped into the parlor, they described that they instantly felt a vapor lock surround them as the host kept on chatting, her voice sounding distant, even though she was right in front of them. Neither of them could even respond to what she was saying. First, they smelled the spirit's familiar aroma of flowers and fruit, the same one of the lady that would tuck them in at night as kids. They felt her gentle touch on their faces and could feel her happiness radiating through them as they heard the words, "Oh, my God, it's you. You're back." And with that, dear listeners, I leave you with this final quote from Andrea Perron. "Fear not the farmhouse, for it is not to blame. It remains as it has always been, a finely constructed piece of architecture with a personality or tin all its own. If one must fear anything, fear the unknown, as life and death are full of surprises." Remember to check out Andrea Perron's books, The House of Darkness, House of Light, if you'd like to read more of their experiences. Thank you for listening, and tune in April 13th for the next episode of Spirited Sagas.